listening to CapConversation, the digital discourse of financial services today with Capco and guests. Today we're going to be talking to Tim Kobe, the founder and CEO of one of the most progressive experience design firms working globally today, 8 Inc. Tim and his team have been at the forefront of designing human experience for some of the most innovative brands in the world. Some of the brands you may have heard of are Apple, Virgin, Tesla, Citibank, Coca Cola, and so many more. Today, he'll share insights into creating world-class experiences and what's in store for the future. Welcome, Tim. Throughout your 30 years of working in the industry, you've worked and helped some of the most well-known brands. Can you tell us about your approach as you're addressing some of the issues that some of these different brands have, and what sets each apart from one another?
Sure. I think if you look at what we do, we're essentially strategic design firms. So what that means is we tend to spend time thinking about what's needed, define what the design should produce, and then designing it and executing it. So it's really an end-to-end type of point of view. And I think that with the brands that you mentioned, and certainly with Apple, this is our 22nd year, I think, with Apple, we've been able to understand that what we're really working on is a relationship, and that in order to make that relationship work, all of these different experience elements have to support it. And so what we end up doing is looking at the values that a company has, what are the types of values that the people that they want to connect with may have, and see where there's alignment. And so, you're more likely to have a relationship with other people if you share certain values and certain qualities. And so we look for each company really to set that up and to define those.
I found an interview that you did for a website out of Dubai, and you mentioned that people were at the center of all your decision making. And I kind of love that concept. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, if you look at any business is in the, they're interested in creating value. So what does that mean? You have to create things that people want, or you don't have value, and then you don't have a business. And so if you're not thinking about the people that you're connecting with as a primary objective, you tend to lose sight of the opportunity that you actually have as a business. Many companies get caught up in the system they've created to deliver those values, but often the operational side of it that gets in the way of the user experience. And so what we try to do is to define the values and the qualities that the company represents, communicate them to the customers in a way that they can understand it, and that gives the best opportunity for that relationship.
Absolutely. That actually reminds me, I produced a children's television show, and what I love about children's entertainment, period, is children will tell you exactly what they're thinking.
Yeah.
And we actually started to use them as our guides. They told us what they wanted from us. And so if we just delivered on what they wanted, we got more and more fan base based on those decisions.
Well, we tend to think about a project, any relationship, with this notion of what is a value creation engine. So we have a sort of a structure that we follow, and most companies will come in and say, we have this great idea. This is something we'd like to do. And in many cases, it's a tactical approach first. And what we try to do is we say, the real question is define the human outcomes. What are the things that you're looking to achieve? Those are the things that actually create the value. And then form a strategy to deliver those outcomes, and then use tactics to deliver against the strategy. So in most cases, everybody is interested in some tactical response because, the latest VR or AR or whatever is out there. But rather than the tactic, we always try to structure the decision-making tree around this way of creating value.
I love it. Now I'm going to get into what I'm sure a lot of people are waiting for us to jump into, which is moving on to the Apple Store and your experience working with Steve Jobs. What was it like working with Steve?
Well, it's hard to summarize in a very short term. We were hired by him when he came back to the company, helped him launch the first colored iMacs, and I wrote a white paper and gave it to him about why they should do retail, and he came and hired us to start working on a blank whiteboard about Apple retail. But we had the fortune, and we didn't know really how lucky we were at the time, but to work with him essentially every week for the 12 years that he was back at Apple.
Yeah.
And so we got to know him quite well. There's lots of stories I'm sure
Yeah.
we could share, but
There's 2 movies people can watch. if
yeah,
they wanna
exactly.
know.
Yeah, they're all variations, books and movies, right?
Yeah.
But with Steve was, he's extraordinary, which goes without saying. But I think that there were qualities in the way that he thought about things that maybe gave him the reputation of being difficult to work with. And a big part of it was he was extraordinarily gifted at being able to think about something from a logical perspective and then switch to look at something from an intuitive perspective. And most people who are really good at providing a logic solution would get past the logic review, and then they'd get put into the intuitive review. And you can imagine people who have a bulletproof logic, but generally it still doesn't work because intuitively he would find a gap in it. They would be rejected and sent back to start again. So this notion that he was in a way mentally ambidextrous in the way that he could deal with ideas and deal with people, and he had no patience if you hadn't done your homework. You were rightly scolded about it. But I think the idea that his processing and the way that he used the teams of people around him to get what he needed from them was about he was doing this every day, and it was his fundamental goal was to creating value for people. And if you create the value for people, you have an opportunity then for the business.
So I read an interview that you did with Time Magazine. And one of the things that you mentioned that stood out to me about Steve Jobs is you mentioned that the night before the retail store opened, he said to you, "What if nobody shows up?" And to me, that humanized him in a way that I never viewed him in that way before.
Yeah.
And it also sold me on the fact that this wasn't just a man who understood technology. He was an artist, because that is, I think, the conundrum of all creatives and artists is, okay, I'm creating this thing, but are people really going to like it? And the art isn't really created until the viewer comes in and steps in and says,
"That's right.
Yeah, this is the art."
Yeah, I think you look at innovation, and innovation comes from people adopting it, right?
Yeah.
And that night we opened the store, everything was set, and the idea that he asked the question, "What if nobody comes?" We were all standing around shocked because it was the night before we were opening. But the premise was that he was trying something that hadn't been done.
Yeah.
The company was a $2 billion company at that time. They'd just managed to pull together enough money to survive. And I think that one of the most interesting aspects of that was the degree of risk that he was taking. And the fact that, if you look, I think there were articles in Bloomberg and other magazines that were saying it was going to be a huge mistake. And so all the pundits were telling him that, it had never been done before, Apple retail would fail, et cetera, et cetera. And so, he was nervous that would impact, obviously, the stock value or the perception of the company. But at the time, what we found was that discomfort was actually a sign of pushing, far enough.
Yeah.
And I think that he was brave enough to do that, and had the courage to challenge the people who were naysayers because he believed it was right. And I think ultimately he was, I don't know, a customer experience savant, I guess is the best way to describe him. But he really was looking at design as a way to achieve what people needed, and he was interested in using it in every way that he could through technology.
And what a gift it sounds like to witness true faith and intuition. I don't necessarily see that too often, somebody who has remarkable instinct and actually is brave enough to actually follow it, despite risk, despite what people are saying. And to see that in action must have been pretty inspiring.
It was amazing, and the idea of courage and the fact that he would exhibit it almost every time we saw him in some form. You just don't see that kind of thought process with a lot of leaders.
Yeah.
And that the idea that he was very comfortable making a call because the logic was there, or very comfortable making a call because intuitively he thought it was right, and equally comfortable, right? It wasn't that one outweighed the other.
Yeah.
And I think that gave him a really unique, distinctive way of working in terms of other companies.
That's great. Some of us, we may all get lucky enough to experience something like that in our careers.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sure he played a large part in your development in your career. Is he the only one, or do you have another influence in your life, in your career?
Well, obviously, Steve was a big one in terms of visibility and really working at a time where it was, continuing and developing our design practice. I started at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena in school, and had a number of mentors there that I think were influential. In California, the Eames office was a studio that we admired a lot. The fact that there was a lot of diversity there, the fact that they really put people of different types of expertise into the same project and extracted some pretty extraordinary results. So, in a way, the teams that worked with Steve also had some thread back through the Eames office, gestalt, I guess. And so being able to extend that forward and then ultimately get to work with him was fantastic. And I think there are a number of influencers, obviously, over the years, but the work that we do today is probably based on the premise of what Steve was looking for, which was to do something that has the most impact for the most people.
8 Inc. does work across many traditional disciplines: strategy, architecture, exhibition, interior design. What influenced you and the company to work in so many different areas?
So, traditionally, you're trained in a vertical. You go out and you work in a vertical. If you're an architect, you choose to work in hospitality or retail or whatever it may be. We thought that was really more of an extension of the industrial era, the way we sort of classify and create these kind of narrow verticals. But what we found is the most valuable component of design is to think about it from the human experience perspective. And if you look at human experience, it runs across these verticals. And so much of the work that we do resonates with the CEOs, because the CEOs are the point in a company where a lot of those verticals come together. And in focusing on the human outcome over the discipline, we found, A, that more interesting solutions could occur, and that we were much more aligned with where the design could create the most value. And so we tend to find that the common thread is human experience, as opposed to a classification of a discipline, whatever sector it is. And it turns out what we're dealing with in every case is people. And that's the common thread. If we understand the psychological impacts of certain experiences lead to certain behaviors. I think Marshall McLuhan talked about many companies focusing on communicating information, but the most effective way to get people to connect with business is through experience. That it's experience rather than information that drives behavior. And so I think that what you're looking at is a different way of approaching design, and the old scientific method I think is kind of an analytical way, again, applying an analytical kind of process against the creative.
Do you feel that scientific approach starts to work against you, especially as the world starts to change? If you're so formulaic, you kind of get stuck in this one thought process, which kind of then starts to work against you?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to keep keep perspective, if you're looking for a formula, you're probably getting lazy.
Yeah.
And that what you need to be doing is recognizing we're always in a continuous learning process. We're always in a dynamic world, and that by focusing on the human outcome, what you end up doing is having the ability to be relevant with people, as opposed to if you focus on a tactic, it may or may not be relevant, but it's much harder, a much lower chance of success if you do that.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I can say is constant in my life is change.
Yeah.
And so why not embrace it?
Yeah, and I think design is one of those things where all design is change.
Yeah.
If you're not changing, you're really probably not designing anything. I mean, that's why we're more comfortable with change, I suppose, than say other disciplines or other categories.
Which project was your most meaningful to you and to your company?
Well, I think we try to draw meaning in different ways, I suppose. Obviously the Apple work had a huge impact on the career and recognition, and the fact we're working now in many different countries. We have 12 studios around the world now. But I think to me the most important projects are the ones that have the biggest impact or the potential for the biggest impact. We were asked last year by a small country if we had ever thought about redesigning a government and the whole structure of a government.
Wow.
And I thought it was a phenomenal problem to think about because the notion that we could learn everything that we've learned, all the different approaches to ways of governing people, but take and start from a blank slate based on what we know today, we might not end up with a lot of the legacy systems that we have. It's a bit like technology. Everything has to evolve, and it seems like government structures haven't necessarily evolved.
When you were innovating, was there an idea that you were ever hesitant to implement or go after, but seemed to work well after you did push it forward?
Yeah, there are some things we say that are obvious in retrospect. They didn't seem very obvious at the beginning, but ultimately we found out that the solution would actually define a new way of behaving or a new way of interacting. I think that when you look at projects in terms of new opportunities, the idea that you're focused on that human outcome can lead you to something that hasn't been considered. And so ultimately that idea of being obvious later makes a lot of sense. But there's typically friction in legacy systems, things that don't allow you to move as easily into new territory. And that's one of the reasons we have this gap between the speed of innovation and our ability to adopt it and evolve with it.
And we've talked a little bit about it already, and you keep bringing it up, human experience. What does creating human experiences mean to you?
Well, I think we've looked at people for a long time around demographics, psychographics. We tried to classify people again in the scientific method. And the fact is, human beings are more complex than that. They're much more interesting than that. And I think that the more we understand about the types of things that influence our behavior, the better we're going to be able to provide something that people want to engage in, that people want to engage with. And, so designing human experience, it's looking at those experiences that then elicit that behavior. And we know from the psychology and the biology, there are a number of other things that as human beings we respond to. And most companies will come to us and say we want to sell more product, or we want to develop a deeper relationship with someone. It starts with understanding human behavior.
How has customer experience shifted, in your opinion? Is it and how important is it?
Well, I think it's fundamental that in terms of the structure I mentioned, we start with human outcomes. You define that, then you can start to create a strategy that will deliver those outcomes, and then you would employ tactics to deliver that strategy. That structure is fundamental to creating value for people. And I think any business whether it's hospitality or electronics manufacturer, they're interested in how they can create value for people. And so the experience, fundamentally is the best way to begin to focus on delivering those outcomes.
And what are some ways that you can see banks improving the digital customer experience?
I think there are many ways. I think banking as an industry, for a number of reasons, has been technically slow to adapt. Most bank systems are pretty old. I would say that given the conservative nature, the fact that it's financial services, and the fact that the technology is really resisted more than embraced because there's an expense and the systems have to be so reliable. It's made it hard for banking to keep up, and that's where startups have had a much greater advantage in certain areas to develop solutions because of the ability to be more nimble and the ability to drive change faster. The ones who focus on human experience is the ones where the adoption begins to really happen. And the biggest threat to most banks, honestly, is probably our communications networks. I mean, look at WeChat.
Yeah.
WeChat in China has grown into a financial powerhouse, but it came through a chat technology, and they offered the red envelope exchange, and suddenly they had billions of dollars circulating through their system. So I think that the notion that banks can be comfortable is something that has to be challenged. They can't be comfortable today, and they have to look for competitors that aren't even in the banking industry as the things that's going to disrupt their current environment.
So you think partnerships might be something that they could steer towards?
I think that can be one way. I think that also they have a lot of things. One of the things that banks tend to have that they don't utilize is a network. They already have a network of people, and they don't exploit that at all.
Yeah.
In other words, they don't leverage the fact that they have a network. If you look at a tech company, the first thing they're going to do is go out and try to get people on their platform. Well, banks already have people on their platform,
right?
But they never leverage that. They look at their financial assets, they look at the relationship to the regulators, but do they leverage the opportunity they have in building stronger networks? Our challenge is to not build the same interaction that the other banks have.
Right.
Not look at the peers. The idea that banks tend to look at their peers a lot is what creates parity in the industry, parity in the offer. Ultimately, what you're doing is you're commoditizing what you have. So as a brand, you don't really stand for much if what you have is the exact same offer as the guy next door to you.
Yep. In the burbs, we call that keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I think you want to differentiate yourself. You want to stand out.
Yeah.
And Steve said the world's a very busy place. You don't get much of a chance to get people to remember much about you.
Yeah.
People forget how complex customers' lives are, and they tend to deliver a lot of complexity. And I think it's important to continue to ask how you can simplify and how you can make it easier for people.
You and Roger Lehman, you published a book called 8 Inc. Return on Experience. Can you talk about what return on experience means? Yeah.
So Roger and I wrote a book. It's actually, I think, due out in the summer.
Oh.
It's with the publisher now, but you can pre-order on Amazon, I guess.
You heard that. Amazon.com.
But what we're talking about is the value that comes from creating successful experience. So we've seen over 30 years of doing work, if you define a positive experience with people, you tend to get adoption and engagement, and it reinforces a relationship between brands and people. The book is then citing different examples. So one of the things in one of the chapters is talking about, beware of best practices. That goes back to not doing what everyone else does, because it tends to make you like everyone else. And so when we look at the customer engagement, customer experience, there's a number of different things that we look at that define how a business creates value through experience.
What inspired you to write it, and what do you hope that it achieves?
Well, I think there's been a lot of discussion about experience. It's a bit like industry buzzwords. Design thinking has become a buzzword.
Yes.
But do people really understand how it impacts their business, and ultimately how it impacts people? And unless you make that connection, unless you connect the dots, it's very hard for you to transform your business
Right.
through focus on customer experience. And so what we're hoping to do is allow people to see different examples. These are from different companies. We worked with many, and how it's translated into business outcomes. But the idea that the human outcome typically generates the business outcome is a common thread. And it doesn't mean necessarily business in the sense of just making money. I mean, we work for a lot of NGOs and nonprofits. The human outcome also translates into the value creation that those companies are looking for.
I'm also going to add, after that bit of information, brand managers. Anyone who is developing a brand needs to go out and buy this book.
I think so. I think the people who understand experience and from a strategic level essentially are the new brand managers. That's essentially how we all understand relationships with companies, and it's more than identity and communications. It's we look at 4 experience realms. One is in the environments, one is the human behavior, one is the communication, and one is the products and services you create. So if you look at those 4 experience realms, those are the ways we understand the relationships.
Now, you mentioned measuring this impact. How do you plan on establishing that measurement?
So we have a number of ways of looking at the different elements that influence each of those 4 realms, and we're actually creating this year an index where we start to evaluate all the companies out there, and we're using a really extraordinary jury panel to do the first one. But what we're going to do is identify the companies who are defining their business success through a better customer experience and rating them in each one of those realms. And ultimately, that will come out as a top 100 index. So if you look at most influential brands or if you look at most valuable companies, those are all partial metrics. But if you look at it in value creation terms, then it's about human experience.
So once companies know where they stand relative to others, how would they know what actions to take?
So we are also working on a tool with Capco to build, it's a CXM, we call it, and so it's a customer experience management tool. This tool is a way of taking any number of inputs that companies have that inform how they're doing relative to their customers, have visibility component to it, so you're able to really understand how those metrics are manifesting in the company, and then a number of outputs that allow you to control it so that you can correct or course correct where some element of that may be failing. And so it's really a valuable tool as a way of managing your business from an ongoing perspective, but through the lens of customer experience.
What type of company would be interested in the ROX platform?
So I think any company really is a potential candidate. We're starting with some categories that we know there's great interest and opportunity, but ultimately, financial institutions, insurance companies, retailers, even B2B service providers have to understand their customers and the relationship to their customers better to be able to serve them better. There's something that Scott Galloway talks about called new algorithm of value. And what it says is companies who have the most receptors in the world are able to derive the most intelligence from those receptors in terms of how people interact with their brand. And it turns out that those are the most valuable companies in the world. So it's the Amazons, Apples, and Google. The idea that every time you do a Google search, Google gets smarter is an extraordinary advantage compared to people who don't have any feedback every time a customer touches their brand.
Always be listening.
Always be listening. Yeah, in fact, it's a dialogue. It should be that it's an ongoing conversation.
Well, you've mentioned a little bit of some of the impact that ROX will have on companies. Is there anything else that maybe we want to highlight that would drive people to the index and the ROX platform?
Well, I think every company is interested in how they can do better,
Right.
And it's certainly the strongest value creation portal that we have seen. Every client that we work with, when you focus the conversation around the human outcome piece of it, tends to either have greater foot traffic or higher revenue or better advocacy. I mean, there's many ways of measuring what successful brand relationship is, and through the experience realms, you have the ability to understand them and then make adjustments as needed. So to me it's essentially a vital tool when you look at the application of creating successful business.
So what advice would you give financial institutions that wants to deliver a personalized experience to the end customer?
I think you have to embrace that honestly, not do it lip service. I think there's a lot of lip service around these things that you tend to get the jargon of the week into business, and it gets passed through the system. But I think the companies that we respect and the ones that most people love are the ones who focus on that. And you either truly adopt it or you don't. But if you truly adopt it, it's going to have impact on your business, both in terms of structural changes probably, but also in terms of the business results. And we've done a big experience center for Nissan, and this was in Ginza, one of the busiest shopping areas in Tokyo. That project, they asked us to grow the audience from 30,000 visitors a month to 40,000. And we said, okay, that sounds good, but we just have one change: is we don't want you to put any of the cars you currently make and sell in this experience center. All we want are the cars that you're thinking about for the future, the idea around mobility, the ideas that you're exploring, and we want this space to be about that. So we designed the space, we put in all the future kind of concept cars, and we had 250,000 visitors a month. So they were blown away by it. Was a very subtle change, but the change was around what do people want and are interested in, that's much more around their future solutions. And so obviously it elevated the brand enormously. And
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to hear that conversation. We don't want you to put out any products you're currently selling, but ones you're thinking about selling in the future.
It took some culture change, let's say.
But it's again, and before we started recording, you mentioned it seems like magic, but it just seems it's so simple.
It comes down to things we already know. We fundamentally know because we're human beings. We fundamentally know these things, and we respond to generosity. We respond to people who make an effort, take care of you, and it's ingrained in our DNA. And so the idea that companies are missing that, to me, is somewhat shocking. But it has to become kind of a key component of any successful business.
So now I know I can go to the 8 Inc. website. There's another plug, and learn about what's coming up for 8 Inc. But I thought maybe we could give the listeners a little sneak peek at maybe some interesting things coming down the road for you guys.
Well, we've been working on some really diverse things. Obviously, working across different countries and different cultures has its set of challenges and what have you. But it's super fun, and I think that we're enjoying the kinds of projects that are going to have large impact. You mentioned the Time Magazine article earlier. We submitted a solution for Notre Dame when it burned.
I was going to bring that up because that's the most amazing design I've ever seen.
So that is a project that again it was really out of frustration that the other solutions weren't really respecting the building, but to come back and propose the roof addition in glass was something because of our knowledge of structural glass with Apple and those systems we thought was the perfect kind of response to that.
If you're out there listening and you haven't seen this design, go look at it. It absolutely does respect the traditional design of Notre Dame, but brings this element, to me, a spiritual element.
Yeah. Well, I think what we try to do is understand the proportions and the detailing, all of the elements that made Notre Dame previously so phenomenal. We shouldn't compromise those. But the fact that it had burned meant that we have a new condition, and by rebuilding that in glass, it sort of honored the existing form, but it also honored the kind of the greater spiritual aspect of the cathedral.
And so many times when you walk into a church, you look up, they paint sky, on the roof, stars and make it look like the sky. Why not give them the creation of the sky from God, essentially? I think it's genius.
No, thanks. No, but that I think was an interesting project. I mean, obviously we're not building it, but
You should.
We should. Yeah.
I'm going to call the French prime minister.
Yeah, we need to lobby them.
Is there a project that if you could make it happen, what kind of project would you like to work on with us?
The expertise with Capco in financial area is very deep, and certainly not limited by locations. Right, you work in many different countries, so having the ability to take the insights that you have and look at that. Maybe it may be in some adjacent industries. I think bringing some of the learnings from the category and looking across categories is an area I'm interested in, because I think again the specialization aspect of it can sometimes start to build up some calcium, and that what we need to do is to break that and work across categories. So I think there's opportunities in hospitality. I think there's opportunities in other areas that would inform better experience on both sides. So hopefully we can do that.
Well, I look forward to hopefully getting a chance to work with you in the future and see you again. I want to thank you for coming out. I want to remind the listeners to go to Amazon.com right now, buy the book. And if you need any information about that, it'll be attached to this podcast. I also want you to check out the 8 Inc. website for any news coming up for 8 Inc. And I'm already following you on Twitter, so I look forward to seeing what comes out there. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing so many great things come out of 8 Inc.
Thank you.
You've been listening to CapConversation, a Capco production. This podcast is for information only and should not and does not constitute consulting services.